The autumn rain drummed against the tall windows of Omaha's downtown Barnes & Noble bookstore. Inside, warm yellow light illuminated rows of carefully arranged books, their spines creating a mosaic of dreams and knowledge. At the center of the store, a small crowd of perhaps 30 people had gathered around a modest display table where a woman in her early 40s sat, her hands trembling slightly as she signed copies of a book titled "When Dreams Cost More Than Dinner, A Single Mother's Journey to Financial Freedom." Sarah Martinez looked up from each signature with genuine gratitude, her dark eyes reflecting a mixture of joy and disbelief. 20 years ago, she had been a different person entirely, desperate, broke, and willing to do anything to feed her 3-year-old daughter. Now she was an author, a financial advisor, and living proof that rock bottom could become a foundation rather than a grave. As she handed a signed book to an elderly gentleman, Sarah noticed something that made her heart skip. Standing quietly, near the business section, partially hidden behind a display of investment guides, was a figure she recognized instantly despite the passage of 2 decades. The same kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, the same modest cardigan that probably cost less than most people's shoes, the same gentle smile that had once saved her life without him ever knowing it. Warren Buffett was here. At her book launch, in person, their eyes met across the bookstore and time seemed to fold in on itself. Sarah's hand froze mid-signature, her pen hovering over the title page as memories rushed back like a tsunami of emotion. She was 22 again, standing in the lobby of Berkshire Hathaway's headquarters, clutching a crumpled piece of paper with a question that felt more important than breathing. Warren gave her the slightest nod. Not of recognition, because how could he remember one desperate young woman among thousands who had sought his advice over the years? But perhaps he sensed something familiar in her expression, the same mixture of hope and fear he had seen countless times before. The customer, waiting for her signature, cleared his throat gently, bringing Sarah back to the present moment. She apologized and completed the autograph, but her hands were shaking now for entirely different reasons than nervousness about her first book signing. When the last customer had left and the bookstore staff began cleaning up, Sarah found herself alone with her thoughts and the man who had unknowingly changed the trajectory of her entire existence. Warren approached slowly, his movements deliberate and respectful, the way someone might approach a deer in the forest, careful not to startle, genuine in intention. "Congratulations on your book," he said simply, his voice carrying that familiar Nebraska warmth that Sarah remembered from their brief encounter 2 decades earlier. "I couldn't help but notice the title. It suggests quite a journey." Sarah felt tears welling up in her eyes, but she managed to speak. "Mr. Buffett, I don't know if you remember me, but 20 years ago I asked you a question, just one question, and your answer, it changed everything." Warren's expression shifted slightly, his eyes becoming more attentive. He had answered thousands of questions over the years, but something in Sarah's voice suggested this was different. This wasn't about stock picks or market predictions. This was about something more fundamental, about human connection and the unexpected ways wisdom could travel from one life to another. "I'm afraid I meet so many people," he said gently, "but I'd very much like to hear about this question, if you're willing to share." Sarah gestured toward 2 chairs near the store's cafe area, and they sat down together as the bookstore grew quiet around them. The rain continued its steady rhythm against the windows, creating a cocoon of intimacy that made the extraordinary feel ordinary and the ordinary feel sacred. "It was March 15th, 2004, Sarah began, her voice steady despite the emotion underlying every word. "I was 22 years old, and I had just lost my job at a call center. My daughter Emma was 3, and I was living in a studio apartment that cost more than I made. I had $17 to my name, a can of soup, and half a jar of peanut butter. I was supposed to pay rent in 2 days, and I had no idea how I was going to feed my daughter, let alone keep a roof over her head. Warren leaned forward slightly, his full attention focused on Sarah's words. He had heard many stories of financial hardship over the years, but there was something in her voice that suggested this story had layers he had yet to understand. I had read about you in the newspaper, Sarah continued, about how you started with nothing and built something extraordinary through patience and smart decisions. So I did something that now seems completely insane. I took my last $5, bought a bus ticket to downtown Omaha, and showed up at your office building. I didn't have an appointment. I didn't even have a plan. I just knew that if I could ask you one question, maybe you could point me in a direction that wouldn't end with me and Emma living in my car. The memory was so vivid that Sarah could almost smell the industrial carpet of the Berkshire Hathaway lobby, could almost feel the weight of Emma's hand in hers as her daughter clutched a worn stuffed rabbit and looked around with wide, curious eyes. Your receptionist was incredibly kind, Sarah remembered, but she explained that you were in meetings all day and that people generally needed appointments scheduled weeks in advance. I told her I understood, but that I would wait anyway. So Emma and I sat in those lobby chairs for, it must have been 6 hours. Emma napped on my lap, and I just sat there, watching people come and go, trying to figure out what I would do. If I never got the chance to ask my question. Warren's eyes had grown soft as he listened, and Sarah could see him trying to place the memory. How many desperate people had he encountered over the years? How many had sat in that lobby hoping for miracles? It was almost 6 o'clock when you finally appeared, Sarah said, and now Warren's expression changed. She could see the recognition beginning to dawn. You were walking toward the elevator, and I stood up so quickly that I woke Emma. She started crying, and I was trying to calm her down while also trying to get your attention. You stopped. Warren nodded slowly. The memory was coming back to him now. A young woman, clearly struggling, holding a small child who was rubbing her eyes and looking confused. He remembered thinking she looked like she hadn't slept in days, and that her clothes, while clean, had the worn appearance of someone who had been wearing the same outfit for longer than intended. You stopped, Sarah repeated, and you asked if everything was okay. I told you I had been waiting all day to ask you one question, just one, and you looked at Emma, who had stopped crying and was staring at you with those huge 3-year-old eyes, and you said, "Let's hear it." The bookstore had grown completely quiet now, except for the rain and the distant hum of the espresso machine. Sarah took a deep breath, preparing to share the question that had seemed so important 20 years ago, the question that had felt like her last hope for avoiding complete disaster. "I asked you," Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper, "how do you make smart decisions when you're too scared to think clearly?" And you looked at me for a long moment, then at Emma, then back at me. And you said something that I wrote down the moment I got home and have carried in my wallet ever since. Sarah reached into her purse and pulled out a worn piece of paper, unfolding it carefully. Warren could see that it had been handled thousands of times, the creases soft from age and the ink slightly faded but still legible. You said, Sarah read, "Fear makes us focus on what we might lose instead of what we might gain. The best decisions come from asking not what's the worst that could happen, but what small step forward can I take today that my future self will thank me for? Start there, everything else will follow." Warren remembered now. He remembered the desperation in this young woman's eyes, the way she had held her daughter protectively, the sense that she was at the end of her rope but still fighting. He had seen that look before, in his own family during the Depression, in neighbors and friends who had faced their own moments of crisis. "I also remember," Warren said quietly, "that you asked me to sign something. A napkin, I think." Sarah smiled through her tears. "A McDonald's napkin. It was the only piece of paper I had with me. You wrote your name, and underneath it you wrote, 'For Emma's mum. The courage to take the next right step is all you need.' I still have that too." She pulled out another piece of paper, this one even more worn than the first. The napkin had been carefully preserved, though the edges were frayed and the writing was faint. Warren looked at his own handwriting from 20 years ago and felt a familiar sense of humility wash over him. He had no idea in that moment how significantly his words might impact 2 lives. "What happened next?" Warren asked, genuinely curious. Now about the journey that had led from that desperate day in his lobby to this successful book launch. Sarah settled back in her chair, her eyes taking on the distant look of someone preparing to tell a story that still amazed her, even though she had lived it. She had lived it. "I went home that night," she began, "and I looked at Emma sleeping in her little bed, and I asked myself what one small step I could take that my future self would thank me for. The answer came to me almost immediately. I needed to stop being afraid of asking for help. The next morning, I swallowed my pride and called every family member, every friend, every acquaintance I could think of, not to ask for money, but to ask if they knew of any opportunities." Sarah paused, remembering the difficulty of those phone calls, the way her voice had shaken as she explained her situation to people she hadn't spoken to in months or years. "My cousin Maria worked as a janitor at a small accounting firm downtown," Sarah continued. "She mentioned that they were looking for someone to work evenings, cleaning offices. It wasn't glamorous, but it paid $12 an hour, and I could bring Emma with me. The office would be empty, so she could sleep on the couch in the waiting room while I worked." Warren nodded, understanding immediately that this was exactly the kind of small step he had been talking about. Not a dramatic leap, but a practical move forward that opened up possibilities. "For 8 months, Emma and I went to that office building every evening at 6 o'clock, Sarah said. "I would pack dinner for us, usually peanut butter sandwiches, and whatever fruit was on sale, and we'd make it an adventure. Emma would help me by emptying small wastebaskets and dusting low shelves with a tiny cloth I bought her. She thought it was the best game in the world." The image was both heartbreaking and heartwarming. A young mother turning necessity into play, creating joy in circumstances that might have crushed someone else's spirit. "But here's the thing," Sarah said, her voice growing stronger. "While I was cleaning those offices, I started noticing things. I would see financial documents on desks, spreadsheets full of numbers, tax forms, investment statements. I became curious about what it all meant, so I started reading." Warren's eyes lit up with interest. This was the kind of curiosity he had always believed was the foundation of real learning. Not academic curiosity, but the desperate practical need to understand the world in order to navigate it more effectively. "I would finish my cleaning duties in about 4 hours, Sarah explained, "but my shift was 8 hours long, so I had 4 hours every night to sit in that office and read everything I could get my hands on. Financial magazines, books about investing that the accountants kept on their shelves, reports about different companies. Emma would be asleep by then, so I had this incredible luxury. 4 uninterrupted hours every single night to educate myself." Sarah's voice carried a note of amazement, as if she still couldn't quite believe the gift that those circumstances had provided. "After about 6 months of this routine, I started to understand patterns. I could see which of the firm's clients were making smart decisions and which were making mistakes. I began to recognize the principles you had written about: patience, compound interest, the importance of understanding what you're investing in before you risk your money." Warren was fascinated now. This was exactly the kind of organic learning he had always advocated, learning driven by necessity and curiosity rather than formal curriculum. One evening, Sarah continued. I was reading a client file about a woman who had lost a significant amount of money in a bad investment, and I realized I could see what had gone wrong. It wasn't complicated. She had invested in something she didn't understand because someone had promised her quick returns. I found myself writing notes in the margins, explaining what I thought she could have done differently. Sarah paused, smiling at the memory of her younger self, unconsciously practicing skills she didn't even know she was developing. The next morning, one of the accountants, Mr. Peterson, came in early and found my notes. I was terrified that I would be fired for touching client files, but instead he asked me to explain my thinking. So I did, and he said something that changed everything again. Sarah, you have a natural understanding for this work. Have you ever considered becoming a financial advisor? Warren nodded approvingly. He had always believed that talent revealed itself in unexpected ways, and that the best learning happened when people were solving real problems rather than theoretical ones. Mr. Peterson became my mentor, Sarah said. He helped me understand what education I would need, how to get licensed, how to build credibility in a field where people generally don't trust advice from young women without degrees or impressive backgrounds. It took me 8 years of night school, correspondence courses, and part-time work, but I eventually got my certifications and started working as a junior advisor at his firm. The rain had stopped while Sarah was talking, and late afternoon sunlight was beginning to filter through the bookstore windows, casting everything in a warm, golden glow that seemed to emphasize the remarkable nature of the story she was telling. But the real breakthrough, Sarah said, came when I realized that my experience, being broke, being scared, having to make financial decisions under pressure, was actually an advantage. Most financial advisors have never been truly desperate. They can tell people about budgeting and saving, but they've never had to choose between buying groceries and paying rent. They've never had to explain to a 3-year-old why there's no money for a toy she wants. Warren understood immediately. This was the kind of authentic expertise that couldn't be taught in business school. The deep, visceral understanding that came from living through difficult circumstances and finding ways to overcome them. I started specializing in working with single parents, people living paycheck to paycheck, families dealing with unexpected financial crises, Sarah explained. I could speak their language because I had been in their shoes. I knew what it felt like to be ashamed of your financial situation, to feel like everyone else understood money in ways you never would. Sarah's voice carried a warmth and conviction that Warren recognized, the same passion he felt when talking about investing, the satisfaction that came from helping people understand concepts that could genuinely improve their lives. Over the years, I helped hundreds of families develop financial plans that actually worked for their situations, Sarah said. Not theoretical investment strategies, but practical approaches that took into account the reality of their lives. How to save money when you're already spending less than you earn. How to invest when you only have $25 a month to work with. How to plan for retirement when you're worried about paying next month's rent. Warren was deeply impressed. This was exactly the kind of practical wisdom he had always tried to promote. Not get-rich-quick schemes or complex financial instruments, but solid, sustainable approaches that could help ordinary people build better lives. About 5 years ago, Sarah continued, my clients started suggesting that I write a book. They said I had helped them understand money in ways that no other advisor had been able to do, and that other people needed to hear these ideas. At first, I dismissed the suggestion. Who was I to write a book? I didn't have an MBA or a famous name or impressive credentials. Sarah paused, and Warren could see her reflecting on the self-doubt that had nearly prevented her from sharing her hard-earned wisdom with a broader audience. But then I remembered your advice about taking small steps that my future self would thank me for, Sarah said. So I started writing. Just a few pages at first, explaining how I helped one client create a budget that actually worked for her. Chaotic schedule. Then a few more pages about another client who learned to invest despite having been burned by financial scams in the past. Sarah gestured toward the display of her books, still somewhat amazed that her words had become something tangible that other people wanted to read. It took me 3 years to finish the manuscript, writing early in the morning before Emma left, for school and late at night after she went to bed. When I finally sent it to publishers, I got rejected 47 times. Most of them said the same thing, that personal finance books needed to be written by experts with impressive credentials, not by single mothers from Nebraska. Warren shook his head, understanding the prejudice Sarah had faced, but also recognizing the irony. The very experiences that publishers saw as disqualifying were precisely what made her advice valuable and authentic. The 48th publisher was different, Sarah said, her face lighting up with the memory. She was a single mother herself, and she understood that sometimes the best expertise comes from lived experience rather than academic study. She said my book filled a gap in the market. Practical financial advice for people who didn't have the luxury of making mistakes with their money. Sarah looked around the bookstore, taking in the evidence of her success with an expression of quiet gratitude. The book came out 6 months ago, she said, and it's been doing better than anyone expected. I've been getting letters from readers all over the country, telling me that my advice helped them pay off debt, start emergency funds, even begin investing for the first time. Single mothers, especially, have been reaching out to say that they finally found financial guidance that understood their reality. Warren felt a deep sense of satisfaction hearing this. This was exactly what he had hoped for when he had chosen to share his wisdom publicly over the years, that it would ripple outward, inspiring others to develop and share their own insights, creating a chain of positive impact that extended far beyond what he could accomplish alone. But here's what I want you to know, Sarah said, her voice becoming more intense, more emotional. None of this would have happened if you hadn't taken 30 seconds to answer a desperate young woman's question 20 years ago. That moment, that brief conversation in your office lobby, was the turning point that changed not just my life, but Emma's life, and now the lives of everyone who reads my book or works with me as a financial advisor. Sarah paused, struggling to find words adequate to express the depth of her gratitude. You probably forgot about our conversation 5 minutes after it happened, she continued. It was just another day for you, just another person asking for advice. But for me, it was the moment when I learned that I didn't have to have all the answers. I just had to be brave enough to take the next small step. Warren felt deeply moved by Sarah's story, but also humbled by the reminder of how profoundly small acts of kindness could resonate through time. He thought about all the brief conversations he had had over the years, the casual advice he had given, the moments when he had chosen to stop and listen to someone who seemed to need guidance. How many other Sarah Martinez's had there been? How many lives had been touched in ways he would never know about? There's something else, Sarah said, her voice becoming softer, more personal. Emma is 23 now. She graduated from college last year with a degree in financial planning. She says she wants to follow in my footsteps, helping people who feel overwhelmed by money and don't know where to turn. Warren smiled at this news. The ripple effect was continuing, expanding into the next generation. She's here tonight, actually, Sarah said, looking around the bookstore. She's been helping coordinate the book launch. Emma, come over here for a minute. A young woman appeared from behind the information desk, carrying a stack of promotional materials. She had her mother's warm eyes and determined expression, but there was also something else, a confidence that suggested she had grown up understanding that challenges were opportunities rather than obstacles. Emma, Sarah said, I'd like you to meet Warren Buffett. He's the person I told you about, the one who gave me the advice that changed everything for us." Emma's eyes widened with recognition and respect. She set down her materials and extended her hand to Warren with a smile that combined gratitude with genuine pleasure at the meeting. "Mr. Buffett," Emma said, "I've been wanting to meet you my entire life. My mom has told me the story of your conversation so many times that I feel like I was there. Thank you for taking the time to help a scared young mother when you didn't have to." Warren shook Emma's hand warmly, struck by her poise and the obvious strength of character that Sarah had instilled in her daughter despite their difficult early circumstances. "Your mother did all the hard work," Warren replied. "I just happened to be in the right place at the right time to offer encouragement. She's the one who had the courage to act on it." Emma looked at her mother with obvious admiration and affection. It was clear that their relationship had been strengthened rather than strained by the challenges they had faced together. "Mom always says that the best financial advice isn't really about money," Emma said. "It's about believing that you can learn what you need to know and that small steps forward are better than big steps backward. She says you taught her that." Warren nodded, pleased that his simple advice had evolved into something richer and more nuanced through Sarah's experience and wisdom. "Your mother has become quite a teacher herself," Warren observed. "I suspect she has things to teach me now about reaching people who might not respond to traditional financial education." Sarah blushed at the compliment, but Warren could see that she was beginning to understand the true scope of what she had accomplished. She had taken his basic principle about small steps and developed it into a comprehensive approach that was helping hundreds of people build better financial lives. As the three of them talked, Warren found himself reflecting on the unexpected ways that wisdom traveled through the world. He had spent decades giving speeches, writing letters to shareholders, and participating in interviews, trying to share what he had learned about investing and business. But some of his most significant impact had apparently come from brief, unplanned conversations with individuals who had the vision to apply his principles in contexts he had never considered. "Sarah," Warren said thoughtfully, "I wonder if you would be willing to do something for me. I'm always looking for authentic voices to share at our annual shareholder meeting. People who can speak about the practical application of basic investment principles in real-world situations. Would you consider presenting a session about your approach to financial planning for people with limited resources?" Sarah's mouth dropped open in surprise. The annual Berkshire Hathaway shareholder meeting was legendary in the investment world, often called Woodstock for capitalists because of the thousands of people who gathered to hear Warren and his partner Charlie Munger share their insights. I would be honored," Sarah stammered. "But are you sure? I mean, I'm not a famous investor or a CEO of a major company. I'm just someone who figured out how to help people who start with very little." Warren smiled at her humility. This was exactly the attitude that made her advice so valuable. She understood that her credibility came from her results rather than her credentials. "Sarah," Warren said gently, "some of the most important financial wisdom comes from people who have learned to do more with less rather than those who have learned to do more with more. Your story and your approach could help thousands of people who attend that meeting, people who might not relate to discussions about managing millions of dollars, but who definitely need to understand how to manage hundreds." Emma looked like she might burst with pride hearing her mother receive this invitation. Sarah, meanwhile, seemed to be processing the surreal nature of the moment. 20 years after asking Warren Buffett a desperate question in his office lobby, she was being invited to share her own wisdom with his audience. "There's something else I'd like to propose," Warren continued. "I've been thinking lately about establishing a foundation focused on financial literacy for working families. Not investment advice for wealthy people, but practical money management skills for people who are struggling to make ends meet. Would you be interested in helping me develop that program? Sarah felt tears beginning to form in her eyes again. The idea that her journey from desperation to expertise could be expanded to help even more people was almost overwhelming. "Mr. Buffett," she said, her voice thick with emotion, 20 years ago, I would have given anything just to know that Emma and I would be okay. I never dreamed that my story might be able to help other families avoid the kind of fear and uncertainty we lived with for so long." Warren understood the weight of what he was proposing. He was asking Sarah to step into a much larger role, to become a public advocate for financial education, rather than just a local advisor helping individual clients. "You don't have to answer right now," Warren said kindly. "Take some time to think about it, discuss it with Emma, but I want you to know that I believe your approach could make a real difference for a lot of families who are where you were 20 years ago." As the bookstore prepared to close, the three of them exchanged contact information and made plans to continue their conversation in the coming weeks. Sarah signed a copy of her book for Warren, writing an inscription that captured the circular nature of their relationship. To Mr. Buffett, "Thank you for teaching me that the best investments appreciate over time. Your investment in a desperate young mother 20 years ago has been paying dividends ever since." Warren read the inscription and smiled, touched by Sarah's ability to frame their relationship in terms that honored both his original contribution and her own remarkable achievements. As they prepared to part ways, Emma spoke up with a question that had been on her mind throughout the evening. "Mr. Buffett," she said, "can I ask you something? Do you remember other people the way you remembered my mom? I mean, do you think about the conversations you've had with people over the years and wonder what happened to them?" Warren considered the question carefully. It was something he thought about often, actually. The countless brief encounters he had had with people seeking advice, guidance, or just a moment of his time. "I do think about it," Warren admitted. "I've been fortunate to meet thousands of people over the years, and I often wonder how their stories turned out. Most of the time, I never find out. Tonight has been a rare gift, the chance to see how a brief conversation grew into something much larger and more meaningful than I could have imagined." Warren paused, looking at both Sarah and Emma with genuine affection. "What strikes me most about your story," he continued, "is how it demonstrates something I've always believed but haven't always been able to prove. That wisdom isn't really about having the right answers. It's about asking the right questions and then having the courage to act on whatever understanding you develop." Sarah nodded, recognizing the truth in Warren's observation. Her journey hadn't been about following a predetermined plan or implementing a complex strategy. It had been about staying curious, taking small steps forward, and trusting that each step would reveal the next one. "Your mother asked exactly the right question 20 years ago," Warren said to Emma. "Not how do I get rich, or what stock should I buy, but how do I make smart decisions when I'm too scared to think clearly?" That question led to everything else. The night job that gave her access to education, the education that gave her expertise, the expertise that allowed her to help others. Emma looked at her mother with even deeper appreciation, understanding perhaps for the first time the full significance of the courage Sarah had shown in those early, desperate days. As they walked toward the bookstore's exit, Warren reflected on the evening's revelations. He had come to the bookstore by chance, drawn by the title of Sarah's book, and curious about the story it might contain. He had expected to spend a few minutes browsing and perhaps purchase a book to read later. Instead, he had discovered one of the most meaningful examples he had ever encountered of how simple wisdom could compound over time when combined with determination and authentic care for others. Outside the bookstore, the evening air was crisp and clear, washed clean by the earlier rain. The three of them stood on the sidewalk for a moment, none quite ready to end this unexpected reunion. "Sarah," Warren said finally, "I want you to know that meeting you again tonight has reminded me why I've always believed that the best investments are in people. You took a small piece of advice and turned it into something that has created value for hundreds of families. That's exactly the kind of compound growth that makes life meaningful." Sarah felt a deep sense of completion hearing these words. The scared young woman who had waited 6 hours in a corporate lobby had finally been able to report back to her inadvertent mentor to show him what had grown from the seed of encouragement he had planted. "And Emma," Warren added, turning to the younger woman, "I hope you'll remember tonight as an example of how careers can develop in unexpected ways. Your mother didn't set out to become an author or a financial advisor. She just tried to solve the problems in front of her, one step at a time. That's how most meaningful work actually happens." Emma nodded solemnly, understanding that she was receiving advice that might prove just as valuable 20 years from now as her mother's original question had been. As they prepared to part ways, Warren had one final thought to share. "There's something I've learned over many decades of giving advice," he said. "The people who benefit most from guidance aren't usually the ones with the most advantages or the best circumstances. They're the ones who are hungry enough to act on what they learn and humble enough to keep learning as they go. Sarah, you were both of those things 20 years ago, and you still are today. That's why your story has turned out the way it has." Sarah felt a profound sense of gratitude wash over her, not just for Warren's original advice, but for his recognition of what she had built from it. For so many years, she had felt like an imposter in the financial world, someone who didn't belong, because she hadn't followed the traditional path. Tonight, she finally understood that her unconventional journey was precisely what made her perspective valuable. They exchanged final handshakes and hugs, promising to stay in touch and continue exploring the possibilities Warren had proposed. As Sarah and Emma walked toward their car, they could see Warren heading in the opposite direction, his posture unhurried and his pace deliberate, looking exactly like what he was. A man who had learned that true wealth lay not in accumulation, but in the positive impact that careful, thoughtful actions could have on other people's lives. "Mom," Emma said as they drove home through the quiet streets of Omaha, "do you think he planned this? Do you think he somehow knew you would be at the bookstore tonight?" Sarah considered the question, thinking about the seemingly random chain of events that had led to their meeting. Warren had mentioned that he often browsed local bookstores, looking for interesting titles and new perspectives. It was entirely possible that their encounter had been purely coincidental. "I think," Sarah said finally, "that some things are meant to happen, even if they're not planned. 20 years ago, I needed his advice at exactly the moment when he was available to give it. Tonight, I needed his validation at exactly the moment when he was ready to offer it. Maybe that's not coincidence. Maybe that's just how life works when you stay open to possibilities." Emma nodded, understanding that her mother was talking about something larger than career advice or business networking. She was talking about the mysterious ways that human connections could shape destiny, how a brief moment of kindness could echo through decades and touch lives in ways the original participants could never have imagined. As they pulled into their driveway, Sarah looked at the modest house that she and Emma had called home for the past 8 years. It wasn't a mansion, but it was theirs, paid for with money Sarah had earned through patient, careful financial planning. The mortgage had been satisfied 2 years earlier, and Sarah had celebrated by planting a small garden in the backyard, not because she needed to save money on groceries anymore, but because she wanted to remember what it felt like to make something grow. "Emma," Sarah said as they sat in the car for a moment before going inside, "I want you to understand something important about tonight. Mr. Buffett's advice was valuable, but it wasn't magic. The real work, the years of cleaning offices, the night school classes, the hundreds of clients who trusted me with their financial fears. That was all me. All of us. We did that. Emma smiled at her mother's determination to maintain perspective, even in the midst of such an extraordinary evening. But, Sarah continued, I also want you to understand that we couldn't have done it alone. Mr. Buffett's encouragement, Mr. Peterson's mentorship, Maria's suggestion about the cleaning job, even the publisher who finally said yes to my book. All of those people played crucial roles in our story. Success isn't just about individual effort. It's about being ready to receive help when it comes, and generous enough to offer help when you can. Emma had heard variations of this speech before, but tonight it carried extra weight. She had just witnessed her mother's willingness to help Warren develop programs that could assist thousands of other families, had seen Sarah's immediate readiness to share what she had learned rather than hoarding her success. Is that why you said yes to his proposals? Emma asked. Because you feel like you owe something back? Sarah thought about the question carefully. Her motivations were more complex than simple obligation, though gratitude was certainly part of them. I said yes because I remember what it felt like to be desperate, Sarah replied. I said yes because I know there are thousands of other single mothers, other struggling families, who are sitting in their own versions of that corporate lobby right now, hoping someone will take 30 seconds to point them in the right direction. If I can be that person for even a few of them, then everything we went through will have been worth it. Emma felt a surge of pride in her mother's answer. This was the woman who had raised her, who had shown her through daily example that strength came not from avoiding difficulties, but from facing them with intelligence, persistence, and compassion for others who might be struggling with similar challenges. As they entered their house, Sarah walked over to the small desk in the living room where she kept her most important papers. She opened the top drawer and pulled out the worn McDonald's napkin with Warren's signature and advice, along with the piece of paper where she had written down his answer to her question about making smart decisions when scared. Emma had seen these artifacts countless times over the years, but tonight they seemed different, not just mementos of a desperate time, but proof of how far a small act of kindness could travel when it found fertile ground. I'm going to frame these, Sarah said suddenly, not to display them, but to preserve them. Someday, when I'm working with the foundation that Mr. Buffett mentioned, I want to be able to show people these pieces of paper. I want them to understand that the biggest transformations often start with the smallest gestures. Emma looked at the faded napkin and the carefully preserved note, understanding that they represented something much more significant than autographs or keepsakes. They were evidence of a moment when hope had been offered and accepted, when wisdom had been shared and acted upon. "Mom," Emma said softly, "what do you think would have happened if you hadn't gotten up the courage to ask that question 20 years ago?" Sarah considered the alternate version of her life that might have unfolded without Warren's guidance. It was a sobering thought, the trajectory that might have led from that desperate day to very different outcomes. I don't know, Sarah admitted. Maybe I would have found another way. Maybe the crisis would have forced me to develop the same skills and insights through different experiences. But I do know that having someone believe I could figure things out, even someone who barely knew me, made all the difference in how I approached the challenges that followed. Sarah paused, thinking about the psychological impact of Warren's simple response to her question. When you're really struggling, she continued, it's easy to start believing that you're not smart enough or capable enough to solve your problems. You begin to think that other people have access to knowledge and resources that will always be beyond your reach. What Mr. Buffett gave me wasn't really information. It was permission to trust my own ability to learn and grow. Emma nodded, recognizing this theme from many of her mother's stories about their early years together. Sarah had always emphasized that poverty was as much about feeling powerless as it was about lacking money, and that real financial education had to address both the practical and psychological aspects of economic insecurity. "Is that why your book has been so successful?" Emma asked. "Because you understand both sides of the problem." Sarah smiled at her daughter's insight. This was exactly the conclusion she had reached after working with hundreds of clients over the years. "Most financial advice assumes that people's problems are purely technical," Sarah explained. "It focuses on budgeting strategies and investment options without acknowledging that someone who has never had financial security might feel overwhelmed or intimidated by concepts that seem basic to people who grew up with money." Sarah moved to the kitchen and began preparing tea, a ritual that always helped her think through complex ideas. "When I work with new clients," she continued, "the first thing I do is listen to their story, not their financial story, their emotional story. How did they grow up thinking about money? What messages did they receive about their own capabilities? What fears do they carry about making mistakes or looking foolish?" Emma had observed her mother's client meetings many times over the years and had always been struck by how much time Sarah spent on these seemingly non-financial conversations. "Once I understand their emotional relationship with money," Sarah said, "then we can start working on practical strategies. But the practical work only succeeds if it's built on a foundation of confidence and self-trust." Emma poured the tea as her mother continued to reflect on the evening's events and their broader implications. "Tonight made me realize something important," Sarah said. "When Mr. Buffett answered my question 20 years ago, he wasn't just giving me financial advice. He was modeling a way of thinking about problems that I've been using ever since without fully recognizing it." Sarah paused to organize her thoughts, understanding that she was articulating something that had been operating at an unconscious level for 2 decades. His advice wasn't, "Here's what you should do," or "Here's the right answer," Sarah continued. It was, "Here's how you can think about this situation in a way that will help you find your own answers." That's what I've been doing with my clients all these years, teaching them to ask better questions rather than just providing solutions. Emma felt a thrill of recognition. This was exactly the approach she wanted to take in her own career, but she had never been able to articulate it so clearly. So the book, the speaking opportunities, the foundation work, it's all really about scaling up that original conversation? Emma asked. Sarah nodded, excited by the clarity this insight was bringing to her understanding of her own work. Exactly. Instead of having that conversation with one person at a time in my office, I can have it with thousands of people through writing and speaking. Instead of helping individual families develop financial security, maybe I can help create systems and programs that make that security more accessible to entire communities. The scope of the opportunity Warren had presented was beginning to sink in. Sarah realized that she was being invited to step into a role she had never imagined for herself, not just as a local financial advisor, but as a national advocate for a different approach to financial education. "Are you scared?" Emma asked, recognizing the magnitude of what her mother was contemplating. Sarah laughed, remembering how that same question had driven her to Warren's office lobby 20 years earlier. "Terrified," she admitted. "But I'm also excited, and I keep thinking about something else Mr. Buffett said tonight. That the people who benefit most from advice are the ones who are hungry enough to act on it and humble enough to keep learning. I'm definitely both of those things." Emma smiled at her mother's self-awareness. One of Sarah's greatest strengths had always been her ability to acknowledge her limitations while still moving forward despite them. "Besides," Sarah added, "I won't be doing this alone. Mr. Buffett will be involved, which means I'll have access to his experience and wisdom, and you'll be there too, bringing your own perspective and energy to the work." Emma felt a surge of excitement at the prospect of working alongside her mother on projects that could have such significant impact. Her degree in financial planning had prepared her for traditional advisory work, but the opportunity to help develop innovative approaches to financial education was far more appealing. "What do you think the foundation will actually do?" Emma asked. Specifically, how will it be different from other financial literacy programs? Sarah had been thinking about this question since Warren first raised the possibility, and several ideas had already begun to take shape in her mind. Most financial literacy programs focus on middle-class people who already have some economic stability, Sarah explained. They teach investment strategies and retirement planning to people who have surplus income to invest. That's valuable, but it doesn't address the needs of families who are still trying to achieve basic financial security. Sarah paused to sip her tea, organizing her thoughts about what a different approach might look like. "I think our foundation should focus on what I call survival-level financial planning," she continued. "How do you create a budget when your income is unpredictable? How do you start an emergency fund when you're already spending less than you earn? How do you improve your financial situation when you can't afford to make mistakes?" Emma was taking mental notes, already envisioning how these concepts might be turned into practical programs and resources. "And it needs to be delivered in ways that don't make people feel ashamed or inadequate," Sarah added. "Financial education that assumes everyone has the same starting point or the same options can actually be counterproductive for people who are dealing with genuine scarcity." Emma nodded, thinking about some of her mother's clients who had described previous experiences with financial counseling that had left them feeling worse about their situations rather than more empowered to change them. "What about the emotional component you mentioned earlier?" Emma asked. "How do you address that in a scalable way?" This was the challenge Sarah had been wrestling with since Warren first proposed the foundation. Her individual practice succeeded largely because she could spend time understanding each client's specific psychological relationship with money. How could that personalized approach be replicated in programs designed to reach thousands of people? "I think," Sarah said slowly, "that we need to start by acknowledging that financial fear is normal and rational. Most financial education treats anxiety about money as something to overcome, rather than something to understand and work with." Sarah stood up and began pacing, her mind racing as she developed this line of thinking. When someone is afraid of making financial mistakes, that fear usually reflects real experience with how devastating those mistakes can be, she continued. "Instead of telling people to stop being afraid, we should teach them how to make financial decisions that honor their fear while still moving them forward." Emma was fascinated by this reframing. She had never thought about fear as something that could be incorporated into financial planning rather than eliminated from it. "Can you give me an example?" Emma asked. Sarah thought for a moment, then described a recent client whose story illustrated the principle she was trying to articulate. "I worked with a woman last year who had been financially devastated by a divorce," Sarah began. She was terrified of investing because she had lost most of her retirement savings when her ex-husband made risky investments without consulting her. Traditional financial advice would have focused on teaching her about diversification and risk management, basically trying to convince her that investing could be safe if done correctly. Sarah paused, remembering the breakthrough moment in her work with this client. "Instead, I started by acknowledging that her fear was completely reasonable, given her experience. Then I asked her what would have to be true for her to feel safe taking small financial risks. She said she would need to understand exactly what she was investing in, have complete control over the decisions, and only risk money she could afford to lose completely." Emma could see where this approach was leading, and she was impressed by its psychological sophistication. So we developed an investment plan that honored all of those requirements, Sarah continued. She started by investing $25 a month in a single simple index fund that she had researched thoroughly. She maintained complete control over all decisions, and she used money from a small side business, so even if she lost everything, it wouldn't affect her ability to pay rent or buy groceries. Sarah sat back down, pleased with how this example illustrated her broader philosophy. After 18 months of this approach, she had built confidence in her ability to make investment decisions and had accumulated enough knowledge to gradually expand her strategy. But the key was that we worked with her fear rather than against it. We treated it as valuable information rather than an obstacle to overcome. Emma was beginning to understand how this approach could be scaled up for broader impact. So the Foundation's programs would teach people to design financial strategies that match their specific circumstances and comfort levels, Emma said, rather than trying to fit everyone into the same general framework. Sarah nodded enthusiastically. This was exactly the kind of thinking that could make their work genuinely helpful to people who had been underserved by traditional financial education. And it would acknowledge that someone's financial situation is often connected to larger, systemic issues, Sarah added. Lack of access to decent-paying jobs, discrimination in lending, limited transportation options, family obligations. All of these factors affect people's financial choices in ways that most financial advice doesn't account for. Emma felt a growing excitement about the potential scope and impact of the work they were discussing. This wasn't just about teaching budgeting skills or investment strategies. It was about developing a more comprehensive and compassionate approach to helping people build economic security in the face of real-world constraints. "Mom," Emma said, "I think what you're describing could change how the entire field thinks about financial education." Sarah felt a moment of vertigo at the ambition implicit in Emma's observation. 20 years ago, she had been focused entirely on survival, keeping herself and Emma housed and fed from one month to the next. The idea that her insights could eventually influence how financial education was delivered nationally would have seemed absurd. "It's funny," Sarah mused, "how life can take you places you never expected to go. When I was sitting in that office lobby with you as a 3-year-old, I was just trying to figure out how to make it through the next week. I had no idea that experience would eventually lead to work that could help thousands of other families." Emma looked at her mother with deep admiration, understanding perhaps more clearly than ever the courage it had taken for Sarah to persist through years of uncertainty and struggle. "Do you think Mr. Buffett knew?" Emma asked. "I mean, when he gave you that advice 20 years ago, do you think he had any sense that it might lead to something like this?" Sarah considered the question, thinking about Warren's long career of investing in people and ideas that had the potential for significant growth over time. "I think," Sarah said finally, "that people like Mr. Buffett understand something about potential that most of us don't. They can see possibilities that aren't obvious to the people who are living them. When he answered my question, he probably didn't know exactly what would happen, but he might have sensed that I was capable of more than I realized at the time." Sarah paused, thinking about the broader implications of this insight. "That's another thing I want to incorporate into the Foundation's work," she continued. "Teaching people to recognize their own potential, even when their current circumstances make it hard to see. So many people limit their financial goals because they can't imagine themselves in better situations. But sometimes the biggest barrier to financial success is the inability to envision a different future." Emma was struck by the psychological sophistication of her mother's approach. Sarah wasn't just talking about practical financial skills. She was talking about helping people develop new relationships with possibility itself. How do you teach someone to imagine a better future when they're dealing with immediate crisis? Emma asked, Sarah smiled, recognizing that Emma was asking exactly the kinds of questions that would need to be answered as they developed foundation programs. "Very carefully," Sarah replied, "and very specifically. You don't start by asking someone who's worried about paying rent to envision themselves as wealthy. You start by helping them imagine what it would feel like to have a month's worth of expenses saved up, then 2 months, then enough to handle a small emergency without going into debt." Sarah stood up again, her energy building as she thought. Through the practical applications of these ideas, the key is making the next level of security feel achievable rather than impossible, she continued. Most people can imagine themselves being slightly better off than they are right now. Once they achieve that level, they can imagine the next step. Eventually, they're capable of envisioning and working toward goals that would have seemed completely unrealistic when they started. Emma was taking notes now, capturing her mother's insights in preparation for the conversations they would need to have with Warren about foundation structure and programming. This is really about changing people's relationship with their own agency, Emma observed, teaching them that they have more power to influence their financial futures than they might believe. Sarah nodded emphatically. This was perhaps the most important insight she had gained from her own journey and her work with clients. Exactly. And that's why Mr. Buffett's original advice was so powerful. He didn't tell me what to do. He gave me a framework for making my own decisions. He helped me understand that I was capable of figuring things out, one step at a time. As the evening grew later, Sarah and Emma continued to discuss possibilities for the foundation, their excitement building as they explored how their ideas might be translated into concrete programs and resources. They talked about workshops for single parents, financial literacy curricula for community colleges, online resources for people in rural areas, partnerships with social service organizations. But underneath all of the programmatic details was a deeper conversation about the nature of wisdom and how it travels from one person to another. Sarah's story was remarkable, not just because of her individual success, but because it demonstrated how a brief moment of generosity could compound over decades, eventually reaching thousands of people who would never know the name of the person whose kindness had made their improved circumstances possible. "I keep thinking about something," Emma said as they prepared to end their evening of planning and dreaming. 20 years from now, there might be people whose lives were changed by the foundation's work, people who got out of debt or started businesses or sent their kids to college because of programs you helped develop, and most of them will never know that it all started with a scared young mother asking Warren Buffett a single question. Sarah felt a profound sense of humility. At this thought, the ripple effects of human kindness were largely invisible, extending far beyond what any individual could observe or measure. Warren's 30 seconds of attention in 2004 had already touched hundreds of lives through Sarah's advisory practice and book. Now it might touch thousands more through their foundation work. That's how it should be, Sarah said softly. The best kind of help is the kind that enables people to help themselves and then help others. Mr. Buffett understood that when he gave me advice that focused on building my own capabilities rather than just solving my immediate problem. Emma nodded, understanding that her mother was describing a philosophy that went far beyond financial planning. They were talking about approaches to human development that honored people's dignity while providing practical support for their goals. As they turned off the lights and prepared for bed, Sarah took one last look at the framed photographs on her living room wall, pictures of Emma's graduation, of clients whose financial lives had been transformed, of the small garden in their backyard where she grew vegetables not from necessity, but from joy. 20 years ago, none of this had been imaginable. She had been focused entirely on survival, on making it through each day without losing the small apartment that was the only stability she could provide for her daughter. But Warren's simple advice had opened up possibilities she couldn't have envisioned, had given her permission to believe that she was capable of learning and growing and eventually thriving. Now, as she contemplated the opportunities he had presented that evening, Sarah felt the same mixture of fear and excitement that had driven her to his office lobby 2 decades earlier. She was being invited to step into a larger role, to share her hard-earned wisdom with audiences she had never imagined reaching. But this time, she wasn't facing the challenge alone. Emma would be beside her, bringing her own insights and energy to their shared work. Warren would be there as well, providing guidance and credibility and access to resources that could amplify their impact exponentially. And somewhere out there were thousands of families who were struggling with the same fears and uncertainties that had once defined Sarah's daily existence. Single mothers working multiple jobs and wondering how they would ever build financial security. Young adults overwhelmed by student loan debt and unsure how to start building adult lives. Older workers who had lost jobs and didn't know how to recreate economic stability in an uncertain economy. All of them were asking variations of the question Sarah had posed 20 years earlier. How do you make smart decisions when you're too scared to think clearly? How do you move forward when you don't know what the next step should be? How do you maintain hope when your circumstances feel overwhelming? Sarah fell asleep that night thinking about Warren's answer, the simple words that had changed everything. The best decisions come from asking not, what's the worst that could happen, but what small step forward can I take today that my future self will thank me for? Start there. Everything else will follow. Everything else had indeed followed, and now perhaps it was Sarah's turn to offer that same kind of encouragement to others who needed permission to believe in their own capabilities. The next morning, Sarah woke up with unusual clarity about what she wanted to say to Warren when they spoke again. She understood now that their reunion at the bookstore hadn't been an ending, it had been a beginning. The real story wasn't about how his advice had changed her life 20 years ago. The real story was about how their partnership could change thousands of lives in the years to come. She reached for her phone and composed a text message that was both simple and profound. Mr. Buffett, I've been thinking about your proposals all night. My answer is yes. When do we start? Warren's response came within minutes. Sarah, I was hoping you'd say that. How about we start with lunch next week? I have some ideas to share, and I suspect you have quite a few of your own. Sarah smiled as she read his message, understanding that she was about to embark on the next chapter of a story that had begun with desperation and was now evolving into something that could create opportunities for countless others. The scared young woman who had waited 6 hours in a corporate lobby had become someone who could offer hope and practical guidance to people facing their own moments of crisis. The small step she had taken 20 years ago, finding the courage to ask for help, had led to everything that followed. And now, perhaps, her willingness to take another small step forward would lead to possibilities she couldn't yet imagine. Warren had been right about compound growth. The best investments, whether in stocks or in people, appreciated over time in ways that could surprise even the most optimistic projections. Sarah's investment in her own learning and development had been paying dividends for 2 decades. Now it was time to help others make similar investments in themselves. Everything else would follow. He never asked for thanks. For him, the legacy wasn't money. It was what you left in others. If this story moved you, not with noise but with meaning, like this video and subscribe to Panorama Legacy. Every click helps us share stories that whisper and stay with you. Tell us in the comments, where are you watching from? And what moment in her journey spoke loudest to your heart? And if you're ready for another quiet story, one about hope that waits and faith that doesn't fade, click on the next video on your screen. Because sometimes what carries someone forward is just one unexpected return.